And well, it's important to understand what Gazprom is doing in Central Asia, what it is trying to do in Central Asia, what interests are driving it, what are the constraints, what do Central Asian governments and companies want, what opportunities they see under the circumstances, and these circumstances seem to be changing. There seems to be a very high level of fluidity. We see supply agreements, contracts negotiated, renegotiated, terminated. We see kind of new pipeline projects planned and they disappear. For example, the pipeline that is supposed to cross from Russia to cross Kazakhstan from Russia and bring Russian gas to China. Possibly it is affected by Russian plans to build Power of Siberia 2. We don't know how it will affect the plans to build Line Z of Central Asia, China gas pipeline. So a lot is going on. It's very hard to understand what's going on, but fortunately, we have two great experts with us who can shed light on the situation and help us understand the context, the developments, and the implications. And let me introduce them in the order I'll ask them to speak. We have Nicholas Pomeroy with us, who is director of the British Kazakh Society. He is an energy executive with over 25 years experience across the former Soviet Union and Central Asia. He has led major ventures and joint initiatives in upstream oil and gas, industrial automation, and green hydrogen, with focus on strategy, governance, and long-term value creation. His current research focuses on energy development and sustainable pathways in Central Asia. Very warm welcome, Nicholas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nargis. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Then we will hear from Michael Hilliard, who is the Director of Defense and Security Analysis at the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs, where he leads the multi-volume Armed Forces of Central Asia project. Michael also works as a strategic consultant, advising energy and mining firms across Eurasia on military security, regional risk, and economic issues. Drawing on his experiences as a policy advisor and defense analyst, he also he's a co-founder of the podcast, The Red Line, where he brings clear evidence-based insights to complex security questions. Warm welcome, Michael. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Nicholas, can I go to you first? Can you set the scene for us? Can you help us understand what Gazprom is doing in Central Asia, what it is trying to do, to what extent these activities are shaped by the legacies, the Soviet legacies, by what happened prior to 2022, and with what happened after 2022.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, Nargis, and thank you very much for the introduction. And I agree, this is a really timely discussion and very complex and very nuanced and many layers to it. I think to start with, I think we need to look at and really to understand Gazprom's current position in Central Asia, we have to begin with a bit of history. So for both the Russian Empire and latterly the Soviet Union, Central Asia was always more than just a periphery region. It was considered a really strategic region, and Central Asia was known as a vital part of the Blizhny Zarubezhny, the near abroad, I think, as everyone is quite aware of. And that status was imprinted most visibly through the infrastructure. That's how it was controlled. Energy networks in the region were designed not just to integrate Central Asia with global markets, but to tie it directly to Moscow. That's historically how things worked. And the clearest example that we have in Central Asia is the Central Asia Center, or the CAC, which is a very large gas pipeline system. And this was built between 1960s and the 1980s in various stages, and still it remains one of the largest cross-border gas transport systems in the world. From its inception, it was managed by Moscow's authority, and today Gazprom predominantly has control of it. And it's really a physical manifestation of Russia's historic dominance in the region. Very quickly, without going into too many details, there's two main branches. We've got the Eastern Line and the Western Line. On the Eastern Line, we have CAC 1, 2, 4, and 5, which takes the gas, historically, took the gas from the southern eastern fields of Turkmenistan through to Uzbekistan and into Kazakhstan, and then obviously north into Russia. The Western Line, which is a more smaller system, runs from Turkmenistan's Caspian coast. There was talk of a parallel line once being built, but that never really was completed. And both of these systems converge in Western Kazakhstan, the big gas transit networks that are in Western Kazakhstan, before they obviously feed into Russia's unified gas supply network. So historically, if Central Asia wanted to export gas, it had to do so via Russia. And what's striking today is even this legacy infrastructure remains central to what's going on in the region. So just this summer in Kazakhstan, Kazakh completed repair and testing of the work on the Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Russia section. And the fact that Astana prioritized this work shows two things to me. Firstly, that these pipelines remain critical for Kazakhstan's own energy balance. And secondly, they're still an essential transit artery carrying Turkmen volumes northward for now. And despite all the diversification and extra pipelines, that Soviet era backbone still underpins the gas flows within Central Asia. But the context, as Nagi's mentioned, as we're all very well aware, has really changed quite profoundly since 22. Europe's decisive pivot away from Russian gas has forced Moscow to reorientate, to look for other markets. So instead of pipelines running west into Europe, Russia's now looking south and east. And that makes Central Asia an even more important partner, not just as a supplier, but also as a consumer and, crucially, a transit zone. And at the same time, we're seeing Kazakhstan evolving. Demand for gas within the region is really rising sharply in many of the countries. We have population growth across the region and industrial expansion. And Uzbekistan, for example, has moved from being a net exporter of gas to a net importer. Kazakhstan, a country I know very well, has got acute shortages of gas in the industrial south. And this changing balance really means that countries are more dependent on managing the flows carefully. And Russia is stepping in to fill those gaps, as what we're seeing. Now, another critical factor that, again, Nagi's touched on at the beginning is China. And over the past 15 years, Beijing's really emerged as a decisive counterweight to Russia. They've built their own Central Asia-China pipelines. Long-term contracts are secured with Turkmenistan, and they've actually become the largest single purchaser of Turkmen gas. And actually now Turkmenistan earns more from sales to China than Russia does. So we're seeing a shift in the old Soviet system, once, as I said earlier, Moscow-centric, but it's now more of a more multipolar contest. So when we look at Gazprom activities today, we need to see them sitting on two layers. The legacy Soviet-built infrastructure that binds the region to Russia, and the new geopolitical reality where Central Asian states are trying to balance that legacy with their own rising demand, energy security, crucially, and also China's growing influence. So what I'll like to do now is just we'll have a quick overview of what's going on in each country in the region, because it's similar, but there's subtle differences. Turkmenistan, obviously the largest gas producer in the region, and I think it's the fourth at the moment in the world. And Turkmenistan is overwhelmingly orientated towards China. Roughly 70% of gas exports are flowing east. And in 2024, last year, it actually earned more from Chinese sales than Russia did, which is an interesting point. In recent years, Gazprom has really played a minor role. They import around 5 BCM annually since 2019, which are small compared to China's 35 to 40 BCM. There was a long-term contract that expired in 2024, which has not yet been renewed. And Ashgabat is actually experimenting with diversification and particularly swap deals. There was a swap deal with Turkey via Iran, which was announced this year. probably more political than commercial in scale. And we still hear talk of the TAPI pipeline going south through to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And we'll touch on Afghanistan a little bit later because that's an important factor in this discussion. Uzbekistan, we've touched on them earlier. So once a gas exporter is now an importer, a net importer, huge growth in recent years in gas demands. Domestic production within Uzbekistan probably has declined due to underinvestment. But as I said, the demand is climbing. And clearly what's happened is Tashkent has turned to Russia for their gas supplies. And in 2023, Gazprom signed a 2-year deal to supply 2.8 BCM annually. And what made this deal remarkable was not the volume, it was that the flows have now reversed. So from the Soviet times when Kazakhstan exported the gas, Uzbekistan's now an importer, an importer. And in 24 last year as well, there was an MOU signed to expand supplies from Gazprom to 6 to 9 BCM per year on the condition that infrastructure upgrades are being made to the network. So this embeds Gazprom much more deeply into Uzbekistan's energy system. If we look at Kazakhstan, so Kazakhstan, biggest economy in the region, obviously major oil exporter, and really remains tied to Russian infrastructure. We have the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which still proving challenges for export of oil. We have links from the Karachaganak facility in the northeast of Kazakhstan, taking gas condensate through to the Orenburg refinery operated by Gazprom. So really those ties are really strong from Kazakhstan. As I mentioned earlier, gas shortages in the south of Kazakhstan, in the industrial south. And Gazprom already supplies small amounts of gas to northern Kazakhstan, and talks have been held recently on larger imports of approximately 10 BCM per year. One interesting development in recent months is that Russia recently claimed that a new supply deal was signed with Kazakhstan, but Astana actually publicly downplayed this, noting that the agreement was just to continue discussions. So a little bit of a conflict there. And my understanding is the sticking point is about the price. Kazakhstan wants Russian gas. I beg your pardon. Kazakhstan wants Russian gas. Sorry, I apologize for that. Yes, Kazakhstan wants Russian gas at its own lower state controlled tariffs. So that's the issue we have there. So Kazakhstan's really caught between the dependence on Russian routes for oil, growing Chinese trade, a lot of trade from Kazakhstan going to China, and actually Beijing is now Kazakhstan's largest partner. And also Kazakhstan's broader ambition to maintain a multi-vector foreign policy. So a lot of balancing going on for Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan, getting onto the smaller countries in the region now. Kyrgyzstan, sorry, Gazprom is very prominent. So in 2014, Gazprom actually acquired Kyrgyzgas, the state gas operator of Kyrgyzstan, for a symbolic $1. And they assumed a 40 million debt and pledged major investment in the region. So effectively, this gave Gazprom control of the whole system within Kyrgyzstan. Last year, Kyrgyzstan signed a long-term supply agreement with Gazprom that runs until 2040. So that ensures that Russian gas is going to be central for heating and power generation in the country. Tajikistan, unlike its neighbors, no longer imports Russian gas. There were some disputes in 2012 over pricing, and instead the country relies almost entirely on hydropower, supplemented by oil product inputs. So in that sense, Gazprom's footprint is quite limited, although the influence of Russia still weighs quite heavily on Tajikistan. The other country that I mentioned, I think we really need to touch on, and not traditionally seen as part of Central Asia, is Afghanistan, which is increasingly being drawn into the region's energy networks. The Taliban authorities signed a series of agreements with Russia since 22, actually, covering oil products, wheat, and small gas volumes. The implementation of these deals have been a little bit patchy, but the direction is quite clear here in that Moscow views Afghanistan as both a potential market and a transit partner, particularly if we have projects like TAPI that ever move forward. And in May this year, several MOUs were signed covering gas exploration, trade, and transportation. And developed suggest that there's a new growing sphere of influence of Russia in the region. And as I said, particularly if we're looking at southern corridors and export down through to the Gulf Coast. I'll just quickly look at the geopolitics of this, and it's really important to remember that Gazprom's activities in Central Asia are more than just commercial. This is more than just a commercial venture. They're part of what we might call the continuation of the great game, with Russia, the West, and China now joining the adventure. And each of them is seeking to really shape the region's energy architecture and political alignment. Again, it's important to remember that Gazprom is not simply a company either. They're a strategic instrument of the Russian state. The contracts consolidate Moscow's leverage, locking partners into long-term supply agreements and structuring deals that keep Russia central to all the flows. And in some cases, we've seen in the region, Gazprom's even proposed tripartite agreements. So supplying Russian gas to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan for domestic use, while those countries are exporting their gas to China. So this allows Russia to behave as a balancer, but again, ensuring that it remains indispensable to the region. As Nargis mentioned as well at the beginning, this also fits quite nicely into Russia's broader pivot to the east. The Power of Siberia pipeline is already delivering up to 38 BCM annually to China. Power of Siberia 2, if it built, would carry around 50 BCM from Western Siberia through Mongolia. So that's going to reroute all the gas that was once going to Europe now through to the east. So these projects, again, it's not about diversifying sales only. They're about anchoring Russia and China in a sanctions-proof energy partnership. So for Central Asia, this creates a really delicate balancing act. Moscow, the historic partner, China, the rising economic force, and Western actors providing the investment and finance. So the real question is sovereignty. Do Russian gas deals provide stability for the region, or do they entrench dependency? And of course, the answer is a bit of both. If we look at the energy transition, which is really interesting for the region, and Central Asia doesn't escape the discussion of the energy transition. The two main countries that are driving this within the region are Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan has pledged carbon neutrality by 2060, despite some of the comments made by President Tokayev this week. And Uzbekistan about 10 years earlier into 2050. They're both scaling renewables. Uzbekistan much faster than Kazakhstan, and roughly about 2 gigawatts electrical of renewable power in Kazakhstan and 3 gigawatts in Uzbekistan. Now, this is the interesting part about these renewable projects, is they're not just backed by Chinese and Gulf investors, but also the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and EBRD. So this is highlighting how the energy transition itself is becoming a real new arena in the region for competition and influence, and how does Russia and Gazprom interact with that. Russia's role really is quite limited in the energy transition. So Gazprom, again, as most people are aware, really overwhelmingly is focused on hydrocarbon delivery through gas. In the energy transition, we're seeing more activity from Rosatom, another Russian state instrument. They've been doing a little bit of work in the renewable sector, wind and nuclear, I beg your pardon, solar in the region, and as I mentioned, nuclear. So we're seeing nuclear in Kyrgyzstan. There's 3 nuclear projects in Kazakhstan, one of which is with Russian, the other 2 are Chinese, and Uzbekistan as well has relationships with Rosatom. So whilst in the energy transition, we're not seeing a huge amount of activity from Gazprom, the Russian influence with Rosatom is sort of balancing that out. One thing I would say, which is quite interesting for the existing gas transmission network in the region, is there's also talk, and I have experience in this area in hydrogen, to the production of hydrogen within the region. And a number of companies have been looking at blending hydrogen with natural gas and using that as a carrier to distribute the hydrogen around about the region. So that would provide a very good mechanism for transmitting the hydrogen or blended hydrogen to the various countries. Whether or not Gazprom get involved in that and go down that route remains to be seen. At the moment, they're not talking about it, but it is a potential for the development of hydrogen transmission throughout the region. For me, the real risk with being so close to Gazprom, because they're not actively investing in or doing a lot of work in the region in the energy transition, is that we lock the old fossil fuel dependencies to the region and don't allow the region to develop their own energy transition. So really to conclude, before I hand over to Michael, I would say that the Gazprom's role is really quite dynamic in the region. It's not fixed. It's not a black or white situation. The region itself is at a real crossroads between dependency and also diversification, between the fossil fuels, between renewables, and from a political perspective, between the pull of Russia, that historical connection, China, the new markets, and also the wider world. And as I mentioned earlier, probably a continuation of the great game, as you will. And really, how the Central Asian states balance this will not only shape their energy security, but also their geopolitical independence for many years to come. So thank you very much, Nargis. That's my intervention for today.
Thank you so much. Let's move to Michael. Michael, could you build on what Nicholas told us and kind of give us more detail on what's happening on the ground and why? Oh, you're muted.
I can indeed, and I'm going to cheat as well using slides. Nick's far more talented than I am. So I'm effectively going to be building on the great information that Nick gave and give a bit of the why all this is happening at the moment. And I think a massive part of it, and Nick kind of touched on it, is the infrastructure. Obviously pipelines can be a bit complicated, so we're going to kind of give a really good analogy to this. And this is actually the rail map of Kyrgyzstan. And most of this being built during the Soviet era. And what you can see here is that effectively there is no rail connections that connect the north of the country down to the south. And what that kind of means is, let's say if you make a pair of boots in Bishkek for $10 and Tashkent makes it for 12, even if Bishkek is cheaper, if you live in Osh, by the time you add the transit in, where you have the cheapness of being able to use the train lines coming through the Fergana Valley, you end up paying much less for it than it would be to import it via the more expensive way through the center of the country. And this happens all the time with gas, where what had been built by the Russians and during the Soviet era is effectively still driving even just free market decisions. Because let's say if you live in Osh, you're more likely going to be getting your consumer goods and whatnot from, Uzbekistan and the Fergana Valley than you would from Bishkek. And that just pure economics has effectively continuously bifurcated the economy inside Kyrgyzstan. And this is what I mean by infrastructure kind of determines what goes forward just simply by free market economics. So here's a map, a lovely colored map of all the pipelines. And, Nick's covered quite a lot of these. But the kind of big ones you want to be focusing on, I guess, for this conversation would be the pink one here. This is effectively the Central Asia Central Pipeline. Yes, what have been really interesting, and we'll kind of talk a bit about it later, is the fact that this is reversing at the moment, which is interesting. Also, the fact that there isn't that many pipelines you can see going east-west out to China. There's really only this big red one here and effectively the yellow here. Most of this is designed to push raw gas out from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan up towards Russia, where the refineries and the later stage infrastructure is. So let's talk a bit about the energy mix as well. And this is, again, a legacy feature. Kazakhstan, which is much more sparse in its geography, has got coal stations, because you don't, with gas, you do kind of have to have it, linked together the whole time effectively. Whereas coal, you can just transport coal in via train and whatnot. It's why you see that the majority of Kazakhstan's power generation is still done by coal. Uzbekistan, being very central, much more condensed, particularly in the Fergana Valley and around Tashkent, is mostly gas. It's got a little hydro. It's starting to bring in some extra renewables, particularly, but it's still generally gas powered. Whereas if you look at Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan's pretty much the same, it's mostly hydro, because those guys have the ability to tap into that, and that's what the infrastructure has been built before this. Now, obviously, there's bits of coal and a few other bits and pieces, but these are still, legacy systems that are roughly analogous with what they were back in the day. What I find the most interesting is this dynamic happening at the moment. This is actually the power grids inside Central Asia. And during the Soviet era, these guys were all linked in together, and that made sense. They're effectively operating as a single country. There was a bit of a split away from that, trying to divert and trying to get a bit of sovereignty on it. But now, Uzbekistan has kind of seen the light, for lack of a better word, and knows that, if you're exporting gas, let's say you're trying to export gas out to China or the European market, Uzbekistan would have to transit that through not only Russia, but also Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan has market incentives to not have all this Uzbek gas flooding the market. Turkmenistan has similar problems. So Uzbekistan has gone the opposite way and gone, look, I'm never going to make as much money, and everyone's kind of working against me if I export gas. But what I am good for is exporting electricity, because it has a lot of the power stations that were built in by the Soviet Union, and it's right in the center. And what you see now is Uzbekistan is importing gas in so it can make more electricity to effectively push it out to northern Turkmenistan, eastern Tajikistan, southern Kazakhstan, and again, most of Kyrgyzstan, because of the legacy infrastructure we talked about at the start. That's why they are really focusing on renewable projects that are about electricity generation rather than, what you would look for kind of gas extraction. And the gas they're using is mostly to make more electricity. And this is why we have this gas union come into play, which is the new deal signed by Gazprom and obviously between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, where raw gas is taken out of Kazakhstan, put up to Russia, where that's effectively made into refined gas, and then exported back to Uzbekistan, where it makes electricity to then pump that to the nearby countries. Now, that obviously has some impacts on geopolitics. It's going to make a lot of these states, particularly guys like northern Afghanistan, very reliant on Uzbekistan. But it does help increase regional integration, which again, I've always been a big proponent of. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So I guess why now? Because I got a lot to cover in just a short amount of time. But this graph should really tell you everything. And I think Nick hinted at it pretty well as well. This is effectively exports to the EU from Russia. And you can see here that this is about normal. Obviously, the 2020 is a bit of an odd year. Then it drops off because everyone's not driving and using as much, stuff when they're at home. But this massive drop off for the 3-day whoopsie doozy. And what happens now is Russia is desperately trying to fill that market it once had, not only to sort of export, but also import and find other places to go. And again, China has not been friendly to them at all. Why the Power of Siberia deal fell apart is before this situation here, China was supposed to fund half of it. China was really backing it, was going to be really nice to Russia. Russia went into Ukraine. The European market collapsed and China went, oh, buddy, I'm not paying into that. You can pay for that yourself, forcing Russia to right now effectively take gas from the Arctic into the European bits of Russia and then back out to Asia at their own expense. And China's not paying the prices that Europe did either. So Central Asia, you can see here, which is the sort of the cyan line here, is still fairly small in the overall scale of Russia's economy and Russia's dependence. It's not going to move Russia one way or the other, but you can see it is, if you look at the sort of difference, whilst there is this, notable growth, because these are very large scale here, in exports, so Russia into Central Asia, there's really not that much going the opposite way, growth-wise. So we'll talk a bit about pipeline and come back to that a bit. So why now? Effectively, lots of European sanctions have forced Russia to go look elsewhere. China is gouging Russia, and they're desperate to try and get any help they can. And they're trying to get effectively more gas into the Chinese market. Now, why Russia? Why not China be funding some of these pipelines? Because some of them are. If we go back to our pipeline map, right now, for instance, Tajikistan doesn't rely on Gazprom and Russian gas, but it does want to effectively connect up line D, which will come off here and go into Tajikistan. Weirdly enough, it'll actually be China and the CNBC who will probably fund that. Kyrgyzstan, yes, as Nick pointed out, is sold all its infrastructure in 2014 and is effectively very, very reliant on Gazprom, not only for gas and heating and everything else, but also for the petrol and everything else that goes around. Now, some would argue that's given a lot of sovereignty away. Others would argue it's the cheapest price. Russia, quite often, like they do in Moldova as well, will sell gas at below market prices. And you can argue and go, hey, look, should we try and get sovereignty, but at the cost of raising gas prices? If you look at Kazakhstan, whilst, much more increasing amounts of the south of the country are reliant on Uzbekistan, the very north is still, now kind of patching in from more and more from Russia. And that's effectively come about from, it's just cheaper, to build up massive loads of infrastructure out from Astana north to these really remote areas is much more expensive than simply just tacking onto the Russian stuff. So why Russia? This is part of it. Russia's economy is not only desperate to find partners at the moment, but the Russian ruble is really, really weak. And effectively, again, I don't have time to go into full economics lectures and I don't want to bore everyone too much. But if let's say you have a lawnmower you want to buy from Russia and a lawnmower, the same lawnmower you want to buy from America, because of the currency problems, if that became a lot more expensive, if you have to convert from, let's say, som back to dollars, and a lot cheaper if you want to go back to rubles, which effectively builds in incentive in the market for all of these guys to make deals with Russia, because Russia right now has a really weak ruble and quite a weak economy. They'll take what they can get at the moment. It's why, defense is what I focus on a lot. And Russia is willing to pay, let people pay for helicopters in resources because they're just so desperate for anything at the moment. And this is the strength of the Russian ruble. You can just see that it's been absolutely decimated by all the Central Asian currencies because it is just a really weak economy at the moment. There's also agreements, the Eurasian Economic Union is the kind of highlighted one here. And that means that there's built-in incentives. So even if China was to put into the market something that would be at some way, let's ignore and say they can build the pipeline automatically and they don't have to pay interest, is still going to be probably undercut by the tariffs and the infrastructure that comes with these agreements. And you can see here this is imports into Kyrgyzstan, sorry. But yes, whilst they're not importing much from Russia, they're exporting lots. There's a whole we can probably we're happy to skip a bit through that. Now, obviously, there's a lot of talk about a few different pipelines. Some of these will be successful. When you look at, for instance, the integration projects that Uzbekistan's doing with the other states, that's been really successful. And Uzbekistan seems to be doing a good job about that. Now, I'm very happy to see that. Whereas there are a few others that are, not nearly successful. TAPI is one. And this is a kind of problem that people kind of forget. Whilst TAPI looks lovely on a map, it's very unlikely to go ahead. When you want gas, you're not looking for the most gas or the fastest gas. You're mostly looking for consistency in your gas. You want to know that, X amount of gas comes down the pipe every day. And if I'm, let's say, an investor in India, Turkmenistan's gas looks fantastic. It really does. But I'm also concerned that, if I'm in a punch up with Pakistan at some point, that they might cut that gas. And if my factory is reliant on that, well, my factory shuts down now. So everyone will be pretty hesitant to already get involved there. But then you also have the massive construction costs that will come with building in Afghanistan at the moment. Because the moment the first bomb happens or whatever, then the insurance costs are going to go up. People are going to want danger pay. It gets really difficult. And a lot of this infrastructure out here, the Americans struggle to build a road and the roads don't explode when you shoot at them, unfortunately. So TAPI, I think, is still a while away, and I think it's almost a bedtime story that Central Asia analysts tell ourselves to sleep at night sometimes. The other one that I think I hear a lot about is the Trans-Caspian pipeline. This is one where, whilst Russia isn't directly involved, this is where Gazprom, like Nick hinted at earlier on, is much more powerful than people kind of think it immediately will be being a gas company. In Russia, it's got its own military. After 2023 Act, it has massive sway over the economy. A lot of teams are functioned by it. But to connect Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan's gas pipe infrastructures up, there's only about 30 Ks of pipe missing. So everyone goes, well, why haven't they done it? And there's a couple of reasons. One is Azerbaijan would have to build some more infrastructure and is a bit iffy on whether it wants to, introduce that much gas into their market. That might lower their price. But also, when there was announcements years ago of Azerbaijan exploring gas in disputed areas, all Turkmenistan had to do is talk to Russia. Russia said, we don't agree with this. And every investor pulled out the next day because no one trusted it. Why? And that comes down to that consistency again, because there's always concerns that Russia will sabotage any of these pipelines, even if they don't just hint at it. Right now, investors like Kazakhstan, I think Kazakhstan gas is great and it exports really well, but also know that right now it still has to transit through Novorossiysk terminals. And Russia just has accidents there occasionally, or weather comes in and takes it out. And that obviously introduces that, how reliant do I want to be on this gas if I know that Russia can turn it off at any point? And also it didn't help that when the negotiations were last happening around the Trans-Caspian pipeline, Russia moved an underwater demolition unit from Crimea out to be based in Caspice, which was about as subtle as a brick. So again, it comes down to that. There's this combination of you want reliance and you want to be able to trust that everything will operate exactly as you promised for years going forward, which again, the infrastructure projects like the electricity grid does have. That's it looks like it's operating. Everyone's winning from that arrangement. It looks fairly solid. Something like Trans-Caspian, there's a lot of question marks. So I guess to really wrap things up, and I've had to cover a lot in a few minutes, economics is going to be driving the policy here. Whilst Russia, yes, does have influence in these countries, and Gazprom is a lever of that. If it's Tajikistan, for instance, the remittance rate is far more influential, or the fact that the 201st is based in Dushanbe is much more influential. If it comes down to economics, again, like we started with the kind of north-south divide in Kyrgyzstan, it's the boots are just cheaper to get from Uzbekistan because of the transit and the existing infrastructure that drives these decisions. The markets are often risk averse. Again, if I'm looking at what I can invest in, I'm looking at the Uzbek deal and going, that's really safe. Everyone's winning. There's no controversy around it. Uzbekistan seems like they're putting in long-term funding for it. I'm probably willing to throw more money at that than any other project. Russia's able to take advantage of the situation. Russia can obviously do things like surge gas into areas when they need it. That's a part of it. But also, like we talked about with the Caspian pipeline, even just the threat of being able to blow them up scares away investors. And it will take significant effort to remedy this. Because here's the thing, even if, let's say, China woke up tomorrow and said, I want to completely and utterly, dominate the gas market here, and I'm going to build pipelines to rival Russia, they would have to put all the money in, build all the infrastructure, pay the interest on those loans, have it not be sabotaged, and then probably still be undercut by Gazprom because Gazprom's often willing to sell this at below cost price. Again, I kept it to 15 minutes and 20 seconds, so look at that. I'll throw back to Nagis, but hopefully I didn't depress everyone too much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much. I have quite a few questions, but I want to encourage our audience to post questions both here in the Q&A section. You have a Q&A tab at the bottom. And on those of you who are watching us on YouTube, you can put your questions there. Well, the first question I have is on this China, Central Asia, Russia triangle. I understand the partnership part. How about the competitive dynamic? Do we see a competition between Russian gas and Central Asian gas, or the Chinese market is so big it can sort of potentially we can see both kind of this Power of Siberia 2 build and then Line D build, and kind of everybody's happy.
Do you want to take that, Nick, or do you want me to take that?
I'll have a go first, and then any gaps you can fill in, Michael. I think the markets are, China's so big it can absorb anything. I think one interesting point that just I'm thinking of from the discussion as well. So Kazakhstan used to export a lot of its gas to China. All those big infrastructure developments over the last 20 years was just built to export the gas from Kazakhstan. And a few years ago, Kazakhstan, or there was a strategy, I think it's still in place, that by 2030, Kazakhstan will actually stop exporting gas to China on those pipelines because the demand is so great in the country, they want to use that gas locally. So effectively, those pipelines going to China won't be used at all. China will still need the gas, so where are they going to get it from? It's going to be from the Russia, the Paris-Siberia link, I think. So, I mean, there's such big economies, such big demand for energy. I think China would really be able to suck up any issues there.
But it was
Michael,
Yeah, I
Kazakh
think.
gas that was the main one. I mean, it's
yeah,
primarily Turkmen gas. Kazakh was
yeah,
very
yeah. I mean, well, Turkmen's such a huge supplier. I mean, that's where the majority of the gas is going to come from. But sorry,
Yeah,
Michael.
I mean, yeah, I mostly fully agree with Nick.
Mm,
Obviously, China is such a large market. They obviously want to diversify a lot more than
mm,
I think a lot of countries tend to do. So they tend to want lots of partners. So if any one falls off, then effectively they
mm,
have can meet loss of demand from somewhere else. But it comes down to Kazakhstan right now is making that kind of a thought of, okay, we have such a growing population, a growing industry, growing infrastructure. If I, let's say, sell this cubic meter of gas to China, I can make X amount of money. But if that cubic meter is then used in my country to power a power station that powers a factory that makes something, I actually make this amount of money. And there's always going to be that trade-off between, well, would I rather put the extra gas towards domestic and increasing domestic production of things, or send it off to China where I get some price for it, but maybe not as much? And I think it's a
yeah.
good sign that these guys aren't just completely falling to the Dutch disease and just being raw commodity exporters, and are starting to actually think about electricity production like Uzbekistan has, or factory production like Kazakhstan starting to. That can change if China, desperately needs, or an export partner falls off, particularly from the Middle East, where most of this stuff comes from. But at this point, Turkmenistan will still be the main source for Chinese gas in the region. But again, there are some positive signs coming out of this.
If I can just add as well, what I'm really liking to see, and I think Michael touched on it as well, is the collaboration between the Central Asian countries. So they're actually working together, looking at opportunities across the energy sector, not just gas, and that may affect things in the future. They're not just sitting back and letting Russia dictate what happens. They're being a little bit more independent in that thought.
So would you say that line D kind of can happen or not? How do you see the prospects of line D?
So I see line D is probably something that's it for the audience. This is the one that kind of branches off and goes into Tajikistan. Yeah,
Mm,
it's probably on the cards, but again, it will take a lot of effort from the Chinese, and the Chinese are always squiffy a bit with Tajikistan at the moment. But also the fact that you know right now, Tajikistan is not thinking too long term. They're trying to effectively focus more on building out more hydroelectricity because they have all these mountains.
right.
But the
Yeah.
trouble is that, as less water comes in every year, as the glaciers continue to melt and melt toward China, that becomes more difficult. So I think it'll be a problem that everyone kind of buries their head in the sand about until it's probably a little late. But at the same time, if everyone thinks that Line D will be the savior of Tajikistan, well, I'd point you to the kind of the offshoot of that same pipeline, pretty much, that goes into toward Bishkek, which has been notoriously unmaintained, and it loses a lot of just through seepage, and has problems with the infrastructure. And Russia really hasn't put the money in it should, and that would probably make some people nervous as well. So I can see it from both sides, but at this point, if Tajikistan needs lots more gas or lots more electricity, it's probably going to be electricity, and that seems more up to what Uzbekistan's doing.
Mhm.
And also, if I could add, routing gas pipelines through mountainous regions is not a cheap thing to do.
Yes.
I mean, that's so the funding for these projects is going to be not insignificant. So that's another factor.
Right. And
Mm.
Nicholas, are you as skeptical as Michael about TAPI? Because Taliban are building something. The
Um,
amount that they are building, they're part of TAPI. And CASA
you,
1000 seem to be happening, and kind of same
so
stuff.
yeah, I mean, so I've been living in the region for over 20 years, and there's one constant that's been talked about in the time I've been there is TAPI, and nothing really ever happens. The challenge we have in Central Asia, it's, as everybody knows, it's got fantastic mineral wealth. There's huge potential, huge reserves of everything. The challenge, it's in a terrible location. So it's the export that's always the problem. Clearly now, with the issues we have in Russia, going north is out of the question. China is obviously the eastern route, and then we've got the western route. And as Michael mentioned, the Caspian Sea, although many people have talked about HVDC cables and pipelines going across the Caspian Sea, that's a challenge as well. So the other logical route is south. And I think with Central Asian countries working together more collective agreement, then, and as I mentioned, Afghanistan is often talked, in discussions about Central Asia now. Perhaps that is a route, but again, mountainous region, politically difficult countries. As Michael said, there's security issues with those assets once they're installed as well. It's going to take some brave investors to move that project forward, I think. Hopeful, but we have to wait and see, I think.
Right. And that pipeline, new pipeline from Russia crossing Kazakhstan going to China is completely off the table, or you would say it's kind of dormant. It might reappear again, depending how.
There's talk of it, but the guys really can't agree on how much each one pays. Because again, Russia was banking on this thing, A, China buying it at a much higher price, and also B, that China would be, paying in half the money for the infrastructure build, which China's not going to do either now because they know that Russia has nowhere else to go. Much like when China was really building its infrastructure out in 2008 and desperately needed every bit of gas and energy they could get, Russia gouged the Chinese and sold it to them at a high price. And now when the table's reversed and Russia is desperate for customers, China's gouging Russia when they can. So, I don't see China budging, and that Russia right now is a bit capital poor, to put it mildly. So that might affect it going forward, but it's definitely on the cards. I think Russia, if they get desperate enough and realize there is no going back to Europe, they will. But at this point, I think there's some people at the top who are considering maybe we'll eventually get back to Europe and we can, sell gas where the infrastructure is already set up.
Yeah. And if Kazakhstan wants to gasify its northern eastern regions, and the pipeline was useful for that, right? It should find other solutions, you would say, if both of you are
Not
consulting.
some of it. Again,
What would your advice be?
I mean, my advice would be much more depressing. It would be, if you're looking at, let's say, Kazakhstan or Tokayev at the moment, you know that to build up, from the gas fields and gas infrastructure in the south right up to the north is a very expensive endeavor to run that all the time. And you're going to have to build a lot more stations, a lot more repumps. It's going to be problematic. Whereas to just kind of build a branch off the massive Russian lines that run just across the border, it's pretty cheap. So, if you think, do I want to build my own gas and have a little bit more sovereignty, or 6 hospitals in the country, I can see why you'd go the other way. But I'm curious to see Lick's probably far less pessimistic view of the world.
No. I mean, I'm a realist, I think, Michael, to be honest. But I mean, I remember a few years ago when Astana was gasified. So there was a large pipeline in Kazakhstan that took the gas from, I think it was Uralsk, and then it's right across Kazakhstan, which is, for people who know the geography of Kazakhstan, is a long way. It's a big investment. I mean, Kazakhstan has gas. I mean, if you look at the West Kazakhstan, all the big oil fields, there's a lot of gas that comes out of those fields. The problem is they re-inject it into the oil wells to maintain the pressure. So and I agree with Michael. I think practical solutions are often the better way. So tapping into an existing infrastructure is probably an easier and less costly way to move forward.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions, but let me prioritize the questions from the audience. The first question goes to you, Michael. How successful, in your opinion, have been Uzbekistan's efforts to move up the value chain in the hydrocarbon sector, petrochemicals, and well, that seems to be one of the key points of their strategy.
Of course, some of it's been successful, and it's doing better than many people did expect, but I think there's still a bit of a cap on this, and that comes mostly from a lack of skilled workforce that is really specialized in that role, and investors looking at it long term. There's still some questions around sort of setting up long-term businesses in Uzbekistan, and they haven't done sort of a lot of the ease of business that Kazakhstan's done. But if you look at a key project like lithium refinement, which is what people talk about a lot, whilst yes, Uzbekistan will likely get it out of the ground, and whilst they might do some basic treatments and whatnot, China's still hesitant to go build those batteries in Navoy and build those batteries in Uzbekistan, and will still likely do that back in China, where the rest of the production chain is anyway. So it may eventually build up, but these are very specialized industries that you're probably going to have to see these things happen on a much smaller scale and then build up from there. Still positive signs, and again, Uzbekistan is looking down that road, which is great to see. Very different to, let's say, what Turkmenistan's doing, but I think it's still a while away at this point.
The next question is about Ukraine attacking Russia's energy infrastructure. What's the impact? What's the impact? What are the implications of that?
I mean, for Central Asia, I'm
Yeah.
not sure of this is a challenging one. I'm not sure of the implications for Central Asia. It's all part of the whole challenge that's going on between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, I don't have a great deal to answer on
No,
that
no,
one with
for
a
oil
deep region.
export, I
Oh,
understand, but for gas,
Yeah, for
I'm not
gas,
sure
it's not
how gas
so.
is
Yeah,
yeah, affected.
I
yeah.
I can give an anecdote, I guess, on this one. You know,
Mm,
Central Asia, I'm seeing when I talk with clients at the moment, a lot of talk about Central Asia, particularly if they're already mining or working in Africa.
mm,
Particularly in the Sahel, it's becoming more and more volatile to operate in, and people aren't sure you can run a 10-year contract in a lot of these countries anymore. Whereas with Kazakhstan, you really probably can safely do a 10-year contract. You know, obviously the idea is that Kazakhstan may be more expensive, it may be more difficult, but it is more safe and stable. But obviously, I'm hearing a lot of talk about these drones, and even if it doesn't make a huge impact on the spreadsheets, and I know that might be a huge deal. Investors are obviously looking at it and going, well, do I want to rely on Novorossiysk consistently pushing my gas out? If this keeps happening, maybe it's a little more risky than I thought it was, and it
mm.
hurts that pinch point where Kazakhstan could have been that really stable kind of raft to go to. So it is affecting it a little bit, but it's more probably psychological than it is in the balance sheet at the moment.
But it seems Western investments are not coming in Kazakhstan in the energy sector anymore, right?
Oh,
That there is
huge
a big
investments. You know,
slowdown. So
huge JVs are in already. You know,
Mm,
any Chevron, Shell, you know, all these guys. You know, most of the Kazakh oil and gas operates under JV or joint venture for people who aren't
mm,
deeply in this. So there is some coming in, and there is more coming in as we go, but it will take a while because there's kind of that pinch point of, you know, how much risk do you have to add to some of these countries like the Sahel before it outweighs the expense and difficulty of working within Kazakhstan and its geography? And there is a pinch point there where that, make the maths, but at this point, you're still, a while away for some people.
I
and
think if
and
I
you
can add,
go
yeah,
ahead.
if I can add, so I mean, yeah, I mean, for the last 20 years, we've seen, huge investments in Kazakhstan from international partners, predominantly in the oil sector, but that has really stopped. We're not seeing the big expansion projects. I mean, for many years, this is oil, obviously, but the Kashagan Phase 2, that was meant to be the savior of Western Kazakhstan. That hasn't happened, and there's no real signs of that happening in the near future as well. So. And it's the likes of the Chinese, it's the likes of the Saudis, the Middle East, the Emiratis as well, who are investing in projects in the region that are coming forward as well, and the Russians as well. So some projects that Shell didn't want to, Kalamkas project, I think it was, that Shell was going to invest in, they pushed that away, and now Lukoil are involved in that one. So we're definitely seeing a shift in the investment arena in Kazakhstan.
Mhm, mhm. Um, Yeah, and who is ready to invest? Is Gazprom ready to invest? It seems you kind of mentioned that there are not too many investments coming. Although, well, preparing for this discussion, I read Sergei Vakulenko's recent
Mm,
piece, Carnegie Politica, I think, about Gazprom's finances and it's a complicated picture, but they do seem to have a big pot of money for investments, right? Are
mm,
ready to invest in Central Asia because they just withdrew from a project in Uzbekistan, right? Despite this growing partnership,
mm.
um, Shohpakhtar
Sure.
gas field. So I don't know what was happening there, but. Does Gazprom have incentives to invest in Central Asia or not really?
Do you want to take this one, Nick, or do you want me to take
Go on, you
take a
start.
swag? Yeah.
Okay.
So
We'll tag
Gazprom is
team
such
it.
a behemoth of a company that, whilst one part of it could look really good, the other parts of it are having problems. So Gazprom Neft, is having problems. They're selling off a lot of the assets they own in places, particularly when it comes to real estate, to cover debts and cover expenses. That doesn't help for investments in other places. And they're probably looking at where the money can be best spent, particularly with the way the ruble is, and particularly the way that, the export market looks. Again, China's buying at a much lower price. And, whilst a few years ago, gas was much, the price was good, there weren't as many players on the market. Yeah, some of the Central Asians at this price, look attractive to take Gazprom and sell more of it into Europe. But if you're Gazprom right now and you're picking and choosing your investments carefully, you're probably looking at it and going, well, the price is now actually here on the global market, and it's even if it gets to here, there are other players in Asia and Africa and a few other places that can come on the market to export, where it does make Central Asia a little more difficult. So whilst there are specialty places that will work, I think they're still looking at low-hanging fruit, and particularly now where they're having financial problems in other sectors of the company, probably the low-hanging fruit and a little less generous on where they're willing to operate at a loss.
So they see Central Asia primarily as a market, right?
Partly a market, so some of it will be to gather, oil and gas from and then re-export it. Part of it will be to fill in back demand. Let's say if you every day, like I don't know, 51 weeks of the year, you need 10 lots of gas or oil. I'm just going to keep it round to make it easy. But for the really cold bit of the year, you need 11 or 12. That can kind of supplement a bit for what they need, and that goes both ways for these guys. China, if let's say they have a fallout with someone, the demand will massively expand in this region, and you want to build that infrastructure in if that does happen. So, Central Asia is a market. It's, obviously a tool of influence. It is, obviously helping build the regional integration, but also kind of works as backups and help if there are changes in the economy or changes in gas price.
Yeah. But would Russia be interested in blocking kind of more cooperation with China, or no? Like from your remarks, Michael, it seems like okay, Russia can do whatever they want basically, and China will be helpless. I'm exaggerating, but it seems like the power relationship is very different.
No, I think they can do what they want where there's infrastructure already in place. If let's say you wanted to get gas from point A to point B and there's already a Russian pipeline in there, at that point when China would have to not only compete against that and build the pipeline and the interest and the expenses to come with it, Russia has the economic advantage built in that they can just sell at the market at a cheaper price, even if China does build it. Where there isn't the infrastructure there, like Tajikistan, China happily just moves into there because there's not really a lot Russia can do. So it is just that what infrastructure was built gives them the advantage, and where there isn't, well, Russia's competing on an even plane where it usually loses to China in this field.
Okay, and okay, there is a question on reservations. So it's clear why Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan are interested in partnership with Gazprom. And well, there is a question about kind of, do they have certain reservations? You already alluded to that, but if you want to elaborate on that.
Do you want to take a shot at it, Nick?
Yeah, go on, Michael.
Okay. No, I was saying, do you want to take a shot at it?
I'm looking for the question actually. So unless you've got some sort of immediate response, for immediate response, I guess there are going to be reservations. If you look at, let's say, Turkmenistan as a classic example, they have become so reliant on the Chinese market where it made up 85 or 86, I'm not the numbers in front of me, at one point of the export market. And when you have that much going to one client, the client sets the price. And there's obviously always going to be that concern of if you become so reliant on Russia, like for instance Kyrgyzstan is at the moment, that Russia will effectively dictate the price of gas in the country. Now, that's all fine and hunky-dory whilst, Russia's willing to keep it cheap, but if things go wrong, maybe that becomes a problem. But at the same time, whilst that may feel icky for the Kyrgyz, are they willing to spend massive amounts of money they don't have, or, make the gas much more expensive in exchange for a little bit of sovereignty? And even then the market will still go with Russia because it's the cheaper one. I don't know if they will. So there is obviously, thoughts about it, but, I think free market economics is still probably going to be the driver here. I was just going to say it's all about the balance. I mean, there may be reservations, but the reality is, the historical connections, the infrastructure's there, so they can't ignore them. But I think we're seeing Central Asia emerging as a bit more independent, a bit more coordinated, and I think that might dictate how things move forward.
And that's actually what I wanted to ask my last question about. I know you're realists and you are kind of embed your analysis firmly in what's happening on the ground, what's feasible. But if if we can make regional cooperation and creation of a regional energy system kind of a priority, what should happen? What kind of investments, policies, coordination mechanisms? So we do a bit of daydreaming, a kind of what can we, imagine? What can we think of?
So if I can touch on something. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what Michael was mentioning as well. The fact that Uzbekistan is positioning itself to sort of be an electrical producer. I mean, we know in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, I mean, the electrical transmission system in Kazakhstan is at capacity. It's old legacy infrastructure. It's only recently they've started uniting the electricity grid in Kazakhstan. And if we could have a Central Asian grid where each country is working to its benefit, to its strength, that would be fantastic for the good of the whole region. So rather than worrying about exporting all the energy, which seems to be the driver in hydrogen as well, let's export everything. Let's look at how we can develop the region, how each country can work and benefit each of its partners in the region. I'd love to see that. It's a few years off, I think, but that ideal for me would be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I'm very much the same as Nick. I think more regional integration, more reliance on each other, not only dissuades people from going to war with each other. I mean, look at the EU; Europe's been at war with each other for years, and then now they're really, really reliant on each other. It's much less likely to happen. Integration does help all their economies. It helps lower costs, and there will be benefits if it's cheaper to get gas out of the ground in Kazakhstan and cheaper to make electricity in Uzbekistan. They can take advantage of the comparative advantage there.
What does
Again,
it mean
will
in
have
practical? In practical
in,
terms,
in,
we need
in
like
practical,
European
it'll
Union has
yeah.
interconnectors, right? Like they invested big time in the interconnectors, so they are kind of, help
Well,
help.
it's that building a mutual trust. If you're, let's say, Tajikistan, you might be nervous about connecting your
Right.
part of your power grid up to Uzbekistan, because if anything were to go wrong, they could cut the power, and that's really problematic.
Right.
But if they do that and it saves a bunch of money for the average Tajik consumer or the Tajik government, well, that's more money to spend on roads, infrastructure, and things that make money and build up the quality of life for people. So there is this kind of, it will take a little bit of a nudge before everyone feels comfortable going fully down that road. But the more they do it and the more they realize that, hey, we're actually better off working together, the better the region will be, because they can take advantage of it. Why would you, if you're going with the strategy for Uzbekistan, why would you build a new gas station where, let's say, it comes out of the ground at $10 when you could just buy it in from Kazakhstan at $6 and make the electricity all the same? That's $4 extra you can put in your pocket and effectively go build things with. So there's going to be that kind of economics versus sovereignty argument that's going to keep coming in. And I think, the more and more we see from these guys, the more integration there is appetite for it. It'll take a while, but I would like to see that.
Yeah, how this partnership with Gazprom should be shaped to kind of fit that fit that vision. Because
I think it comes
understandably,
in.
it's very attractive, very attractive, super feasible. The infrastructure is there. Russia is full of gas, and it can sell it at a sort of lower prices. And where else would you get gas, basically? And you do need, I
Yeah.
understand that you do need, it's not just okay, of course, it's a fossil fuel, but at the same time, it's a cleaner fossil fuel. And it can be quite useful as a transition fuel, right? To kind of back up
I mean,
green.
I think one of the best precursors to this was during the Soviet era. There was a lot of exchange where, let's say, Uzbekistan would push gas or electricity into Tajikistan, and Tajikistan would push more water into Uzbekistan. They could work with each other and get the best of both worlds. And I think that is a model that, yes, Gazprom might be a part of that, but more and more where they find where the comparative advantage is between them, the
So
better
more
off they're overall.
coordination and
More
maybe
coordination will be better.
maybe
Plus, they're less likely to fight each other. They're more likely to work together as a partnership. I think it's probably better for the region.
well, there are
So
attempts to
I'm always
create
happy
this,
to see.
water energy consortium, right? That I came
That
up with this
nexus.
idea, and now they are reforming IFAS, and so let's see what happens.
I think what we need to see is better energy policy for the region as well, Nargis, both
Mhm.
within each country and also interregionally as well, because it seems to be, I mean, certainly in Kazakhstan, we go from one flavor of the month, which is green hydrogen, then we go to nuclear, and what's going to be next? It's if we had some sort of consistent, long-reaching policy
Right.
that took in the whole region, I think that would be a massive step forward. And maybe some gas councils of Central Asia or hydrogen councils of Central Asia are the things that from the West, that's how we can support and develop those regions. So taking the politics away and looking at the real practicalities and the benefits for the region.
Absolutely. I'm into that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicholas. Thank you so much, Michael. And I also want to thank Laura Sargent and Adam Wozniak, who helped to put this I think, great event together. Thank you so much, and have a nice weekend.